Growing up, I played a lot of Mario games. Nintendo was my main source of entertainment for the vast majority of my childhood, and Mario stood as king for much of it. But a thought occurred to me as I was racking my brain not too long ago, one that had been buried for a long time. What about Wario? It didn't even cross my mind how much I played Wario games until I started to fondly recall just how many times I had beaten Wario Land 3 and 4. It led me to the question, what happened to Wario? Sure, he's still around in party games, sports games, and other miscellaneous games, but where did his games go? His jurisdiction seems to have landed in another series which I absolutely adore, WarioWare. And it made me start to wonder if the older games that he made his first appearance in as the main character were actually good, or if the nostalgia goggles were in full effect. So I set out to play some long-forgotten games just to see how well they hold up today. To kick this adventure off, I started with the sequel to Super Mario Land 2, Wario Land for the Game Boy. When the game starts up, you're almost immediately treated to the fat greedy dickhead that Wario is, and it's still a refreshing change of pace from the wholesome games that Nintendo brought itself up on. It's made almost excessively clear that Wario isn't a good guy. He's not trying to save a princess or redeem himself or stop the land from being taken over by evil so that everyone can live happily. He wants money and a big fat castle to spite Mario, and he's gonna take everything from anyone in his way. It's a harsh shift from the Mario franchise, and I love it with all my heart. As for the actual gameplay, Wario Land is a surprisingly floaty platformer that is all about getting to the end of the level while incentivizing the player to collect as much money as possible. In my experience, it's probably one of the most intuitive games I've played in a very long time, and that's keeping in mind that I've never beat this game or even played it for about 15 years or so. The power-ups consist of different hats that give Wario a power that completely morphs his gameplay style with each iteration, including such flavors as the bull, the dragon, garlic, and the pelican, I think, although it kinda looks like a bunny in the game. Wario Land isn't shy about handing these power-ups out, which definitely makes the game very easy, but they also give each level a distinct flavor of how to proceed through it. At the end of every level, you get a chance to play a bonus game for more lives, which is total bullshit, don't play it. Or a chance to earn more money, which is then banked at the end of the level, showing your career earnings. The entire game made me want to grab as much money as possible and try my best to fill the bank, even when I had zero idea as to what the hell it did. Wario continues to bully enemies by either smashing into them with all of his meaty girth, or by picking them up like a bowling ball and flinging them into each other, and it just feels powerful and rewarding. One of the more interesting technical things to note here is the enemy spawning. Most games in the genre that I've played around this era tend to have an aspect of enemies respawning as soon as you walk a little ways away, but they stay dead in Wario Land. This means if they're at the start of their patrol when you leave them, they'll likely be in another part of it when you double back. The same interaction occurs with items and power-ups and blocks and hearts and anything that you might have bypassed as well, even from multiple screens away. Overall, the game is good for its time, but it has a few flaws. Its overarching theme of greed both rewards and punishes the player for risking dangerous jumps and paths for more loot. It encourages exploration and throws a variety of enemy types at this clunky dwarf of a man, which keeps the game fresh. But it also starts to run dry in terms of level design and enemy types right around the SST cup, as the game begins to feel more and more like the same thing over and over again with a host of water levels, railway levels, and goddamn boulder levels. The one and only level in the entire Parsley Woods that involves a tree has water and mines and sea porcupines in it, which are all hazards that you've been encountering for a while now. The endgame tends to just keep repeating the same types of rooms over and over again, seemingly with the hope that you'll eventually just die from falling into a hazard after a while. The bosses are woefully easy and range from hey, jump on this turtle to hey, throw Evil Dalsum's snot rockets back at him. While Evil Dalsum is definitely the most interesting boss, the way that you beat him takes the same amount of effort as Large Avian, Deformed Penguin, and this fucking bull. Even Sleep Paralysis Ghost uses the same philosophy as these fights. The various worlds after Rice Beach begin by sticking to a standout theme for the area, but seem to stop after the third world or so. Ironically, the most unique and interesting level design and boss design is quite literally the last level, which only further causes me to dislike that the rest of them were so humdrum from the mid to late game. I'd say that the game is easy enough to get through, but takes more effort to perfect, as it does actually have several different endings the way that Luigi's Mansion later emulates. I got the ending where Wario gives up all of his treasure for a fucking stump. Wario Land is a technically impressive display for its time while still deeply flawed, and is probably one of the only Nintendo games that tells you to try again for not doing well enough rather than thanking you for playing. When I moved on to Wario Land 2, the difference was almost staggering in terms of a complete overhaul to the pre-existing gameplay that the first entry built. The story starts with these little goofballs enacting their revenge by flooding Wario's newly built tree stump, taking all of his hard-stolen cash, and waking him up for some reason. Immediately, tons of new mechanics are thrown at the player, and again, it's all very intuitive. Every new addition to the game feels really solid and fun in its own right. There are no power-ups, but there are instead these odd interactions between different enemy types that squash, morph, and change Wario in a way that helps him progress. The Wario series is fucking weird, but it's also very charming and interesting to look at a lot of the time, and Wario Land 2 really epitomizes this. The flavors brought to you in this game include being pancaked into a goofy floating disc, zombification which prevents you from jumping and automatically causes you to fall through these thinner platforms, getting turned into a bouncy spring, bulking up into the perfect specimen, being lit actually on fire until you burn to ash, and so on. The conditions in this game are really clever, and sometimes you need them to continue forward, and sometimes you need to avoid them as an obstacle to overcome as you progress. The next thing you'll notice is that there aren't any lives. There's no dying, no checkpoints. If you miss a jump or lose to a boss, you get sent away from that area and you have to loop around to try again. A lot of the time, it's advantageous to lose to the boss the first time to discover a new chunk of the map. Every level has you collecting coins on coins on coins, even more so than the first game. Wario Land 2 takes that feel-good sensation when exploring from the first game and just multiplies it, as you collect these big shiny coins and treasures throughout each stage. At the end, you're given the option of a bonus game, although this time it's always one mode and you always lose money to win the game. The reward is a map piece which later is used in tandem with the treasures to access an alternate ending and area. Chapter progression is a bit more clunky this time as you're forced to move on to the next stage without the option to repeat the former one immediately. This proves a bit problematic when you're trying to find all of the optional stages. A few stages have an alternate exit which leads to a branching stage. Completing the optional stages moves you along the storyline regardless, meaning that you'll have to wait until the end of the game to revisit the ones that you missed. Later on, when you beat the game, you get the option to redo stages. It's not the worst system in the world, but it is a bit counterintuitive for a newcomer. Then again, one could argue that getting the normal ending first gives the game some replayability, the same way that the former game's ending system worked. As for the actual level environments, there's a lot more variation in Wario Land 2, which is a big plus. Levels are designed to make you want to explore, and that's great. There are definitely a few parts that are more harrowing to get through, and mostly involve vertical climbing with consistently respawning enemies that try to knock you all the way back down. In particular, I didn't enjoy most of Chapter 4 or 5 at all. The city was nice enough to look at, but a lot of it involved things like climbing all the way to the top of a building and then getting knocked on your ass all the way up it, and navigating the inside of a maze-like building with Heavenly Body Wario. The last chapter in the game succumbs to the same ailment which plagues Wario Land 1, a lack of new ideas. Syrup Castle is bogged down with the same concepts over and over, which is sad to see because the game is arguably one of the best platformers on the Game Boy. The most absurd part about this is the fact that there are new ideas presented here, but no real puzzles built around them beyond if this thing touches you, you're fucked until you hit a wall or get some water. Unlike the previous entry, Wario Land 2's enemies do respawn when you leave the room, and sometimes when you just move away a tad. This is both a boon and a curse, as you may sometimes kill an enemy that's needed to progress accidentally, but you can just move away and respawn them. But you might also get donked repeatedly by the same enemies over and over while you're trying to progress. The latter half of this double-edged sword is what crushed the last part of the game for me. Even the final boss, which isn't technically the last boss, but casually it is this gypsy from the last game who climbs into her Dr. Wily Robotnik Eggman device and just starts floating back and forth. It really took the wind out of my sails because it's easily the least interesting and inspired boss in the whole game. But moreover, it's fucking annoying. How do you make it so the player fails the boss fight? Well, obviously, you send a pillar of fire directly up Wario's asshole and make the player perform their best Ferris wheel impression as they loop back around to fight the boss again. Overall, Wario Land 2 is a really fun game that suffers from a poor ending, at least casually. The branching paths are fun as hell to try to find, and include stuff like you just sleeping through the alarm clock in the very first level until you're tossed out of your own castle, which is pretty funny. I definitely recommend giving the game a try if you're curious, but with the stipulation that you might feel a little let down from the first playthrough's final phase. Now it's time for Wario Land 3. This was easily one of my favorite games when I was a child, and I hadn't played it for a long time, which naturally means that I forgot most things about it. Still, re-experiencing Wario Land 3 was a really fun adventure that makes me miss the series even more than I already did. In this leg of Wario's escapades, he's sucked into a magic box in which a figure needs his help, with the promise of treasure for his efforts, of course. It's simple, but it doesn't really need to be any more complex than that. Speaking of simple, players of the previous entry will notice the very minimal amount of feats which Wario can perform comparatively. There's no ground pound, no picking enemies up, no swimming, no high jumping. There are all sorts of chunks of the first level that seem to be accessible, but you just don't have the resources to get to them. This is due to the fact that every level is meant to be revisited with different permanent moves and powers, which you gain from progressing. It's an interesting system to extend the game further without packing in a lot more levels. So as you progress through the first few stages, you're on the struggle bus to gather the first of the 4 chests until you finally start to get new power-ups which allow you to do a lot of the things that Wario Land 2 allowed you to do right off the bat. This isn't always the case though, as the game eventually teaches you that the day-night cycle actually affects levels as well, if you hadn't been paying attention to it already. For example, the Desert Ruins levels showcases a sun and a moon door, which are unlocked according to the time of day. If you progress as normal without repeating any of the first levels, it's nighttime, and the moon door leads you to the red chest, which doesn't allow you to unlock the next part of the map like the gray chest does. Playing the level again reveals a shift in doors and a change in enemy types and behaviors. It's a really fun way to keep the game interesting while still placing you in the same levels. The conditions and general mechanics of this entry are similar to the last in that you have no lives or health. Everything is about you trying to make your way through condition-causing enemy types to get to the chest that you want to open, which also requires the same color of key. As for the flavors of conditions in this game, many of the old ones return, but with the added bonuses of turning into a powerful vampire which can fly around as a bat, an invisibility mechanic, merging with a snowball to become an unstoppable force, and being cleaved in fucking half. The different animations and the way that Wario squashes and stretches are incredibly well done, with Wario's face twisting into different grimaces and exasperations depending on what he's hit by. Now, all of this sounds pretty good and fun on the surface, but it really depends on the mindset that you bring to the game. As cool as it is that all of the levels shift and morph depending on the time of day or the treasures you've received, it's horrendous to try and explore at the beginning of the game. There are many times where the game will give you access to a certain key, but then you're unable to cross the barrier to get to the corresponding chest due to the lack of a certain upgrade. It also makes collecting the music coins at the beginning of the game completely meaningless. Much like Super Mario 64's 8 red coin levels, there are 8 giant musical coins in every stage. When I first started out, I thought that I could come back for the rest that I couldn't reach at first. But as with Super Mario 64, you have to collect them all in one go. This becomes increasingly annoying when you happen to get 4 out of 8 and you go, hey, I could probably get the rest, only to have the last coin sealed behind an area that you can't reach yet. This literally happened to me, and it was the point where I told myself that I'm not going to explore anymore, that I'm just going to try to jam through the game until I have all of the upgrades. This is where the beautifully built exploration system works against you, and it's sad to see it squandered the way that it is. Now, you might be wondering what you do with all of the coins that you gather in Wario Land 3. You might not, I'm gonna tell you anyways. Golf. Golf. This is another fun idea that's just ruined by its own layout. In order to obtain certain chests, you have to play a golf minigame, which involves you charging the amount of power in your shot and then hitting the accuracy portion of the bar. After taking some time to get the system down pat, I realized that I kept landing in various bunkers, rough grass, and hazards. That's when I figured out that you could look downrange to see the furthest the shot could go, which helped to avoid these hazards. Unfortunately, the layout of the course seems to be completely random, which meant that a lot of the time if I didn't avoid hazards in just the correct way, my entire run would be ruined because my options were limited to landing in the water or landing in some obstacle that I intentionally just avoided. course layouts seem to offer a few different options, from the perfect course to nothing but sand to hey, this is the furthest your shot can go, but fuck you, it actually goes further than that. In other words, golf is bullshit. Wario Land 3 is probably one of the only games I could describe as, hey, don't play this game in one sitting, because you're probably going to want to introduce the business end of a hammer to your Game Boy by the time that you're done. Many of the levels have very fun layouts and interesting design choices, but as with Wario Land 2, the lack of lives and health makes the challenges in the game revolve around Wario jumping at the right moment and reacting instantly to whatever threat pops up. The stages tend to range from a friendly and fun puzzle that feels just right to what could be considered a hate crime against the player. Alright, just gotta line this pancake up perfectly. Alright, just gotta jump a little. Alright, maybe I'll, alright, maybe. Oh, thank God. Daddy's here for his big red chest, kiddos. As much as I wanted to power through the game, I had to take regular intervals away from it before coming back for more. And I think that's a main point to note here. I did want to return to the game. I wasn't still stewing on a stage design or was still angry about a cheap death. I was ready to collect more treasure and see what I unlocked next. That telling detail is something I have to applaud Wario Land 3 for, because the game did feel good to play. And it did feel rewarding to finally get to a chest after a long segment of platforming or figuring out a complicated puzzle. All in all, Wario Land 3 is a good game for its time. It tends to get more agitating as time goes on, and suffers from a few extremely annoying choices with key placements. The choice to include no lives or health system is easily the best call when designing the game, as many of the complex puzzles would be ruined if you took damage in addition to being knocked away and having to start the whole segment over. There are no alternate endings, which is a bummer compared to its predecessors, especially since it seems to have the perfect system for it. You can fight the final boss before collecting all the treasure, and 100%ing the game only rewards you with a time attack mode. The final boss itself is really easy and is only bogged down by having to watch a game over screen and returning to the main menu to reload your last save if you do happen to get clapped by Fat Clown Rayman. But at any rate, I thoroughly enjoyed Wario Land 3, despite its shortcomings. Oh, and I didn't collect all of the music coins in every stage, so I decided to look it up to see what reward you received. I thought, maybe there actually is another ending, or maybe there's a cool Easter egg. It's golf. You get to play golf. What the fuck is wrong with this? Wario Land 4 is the next game in the series, debuting on the Game Boy Advance in 2001. The first thing you'll notice besides the Batman introduction of this absolute unit is how much more odd this game is comparatively to the previous entries. Wario's always been weird, but this game cranks it up to 11 in terms of sheer oddity. There are many elements that are pulled from here which later go on to surface in the WarioWare franchise's first release in 2003, right down to the actual minigames, music, and sound effects. Alright, there's a lot to break down here, so let's get the story out of the way first. There's a big pyramid filled with treasure, and Wario wants the treasure. Alright, now that we've got the godfather of video game plots out of the way, let's talk mechanics. Wario Land 4 turns the series' established traits on its head with the introduction of a bona fide health system. Your main goal appears to once again be about grabbing as much treasure as possible while proceeding to the exit, while also assembling 4 chunks of a jewel to unlock the next boss door, while also grabbing the key to escape to the next stage. At the end of every level, you have to hit a switch which triggers an escape scene, complete with erratic music and a countdown timer. If the timer hits 0, you start losing your collected treasure until you get to the exit. Once you complete the required amount of jewels, you are then able to fight the passage boss. But before that, you're able to spend your money on minigames. This is a pretty unique system in that you play these minigames and then you can earn special types of coins while playing them. You can then exchange these new coins at the shop, which gives you a helper to basically lower the health pool of the boss if you want to. Personally, I found that I didn't actually need them per se, but they do make fighting each boss much less frustrating. The issue here is that if you take too long to defeat the boss, you start losing out on the treasure which rests in the background. This becomes problematic because you don't understand the boss's quirks or mannerisms when you first go into it, and you need a little extra time to figure out how to quickly defeat them. An example of this occurred to me when I fought the Little Shop of Horrors boss. Your objective here is to ground pound its big dumb head until it dies. The issue is that when you do this, it flips the fuck out every time, which takes up a sizable chunk of the clock. So in my first bout, I was losing treasure and I had to figure out how to get him to the next phase quicker, so I just reset basically, and I eventually figured out how to manipulate him in the second round so that I could defeat him faster. I guess you could argue that this is just another one of the game's puzzles, but I didn't enjoy it as much just due to the sheer repetition derived from his larger starting health pool. And on top of that, when I did lose a chest later on to a different boss and then I wound up beating the boss, I found out that I couldn't rematch it for its remaining treasure. But the alternative, of course, is playing these minigames, which were interesting gimmicks as a whole, but I found them super boring in terms of actual content. The 3 games range from hitting home runs, to jumping over obstacles, to assembling Bato from Ghost in the Shell.
Hi.
The game is extraordinarily organic when it comes to letting the player teach themselves how the game works, and how the levels flow. Sure, there's some hieroglyphic type designs in the tutorial level which teach the basics, but everything else is up to the player to discover. For example, there are these blocks throughout the level that may be transparent or solid depending on if the escape timer's been pressed. You'll notice that sometimes the key or a jewel piece may be locked behind one of these solid blocks, and you'll have to take a mental note of its approximate location to come back during the escape. This system is fine, but it also raised a potential fear of mine early on in the game. What if I just missed a jewel piece during my initial exploration? The problem is that you don't always see exactly where a chest might be to soothe your fears. And that stress of not knowing if you simply just didn't explore well enough is a tad annoying when you go to press the end timer with only half of the chunks collected. My fears were only realized a few times, fortunately, and you get to keep everything that you already collected anyways. Another thing of note here in Wario Land 4 is the music and sound effects. The soundtrack is by no means bad. There are songs that stick out as pretty fun and interesting to listen to, and there are songs with odd vocal harmonies which don't seem to belong but at the same time do seem to belong. A lot of these tracks are actually used later in WarioWare games, which should tell you something about how off-putting they are to hear in a platformer. And that's exactly what Wario Land 4 is. It's a platformer with light puzzle elements. If the player pays attention, they'll find hidden surfaces to smash through, bonus areas to uncover, and puzzle rooms to solve. The puzzle rooms in particular usually revolve around you slinging this big brainy boy around like Mewtwo King's Marth, while attempting to use him to break objects and hit switches in order to collect the reward at the end. It's a pretty fun way to challenge the player with a puzzle while drilling this song into their head for the rest of their fucking lives. The game still has the same morphing elements as the previous entries, albeit with some good quality of life changes that keep the game moving along nicely. Enemies are a bit strange in that they work against a lot of your established instincts as to what's going to morph Wario and what isn't. For example, the guys with hammers and the bees are easy enough to know because they're based off of previous games. But I avoided the shit out of these little arrow boys because I figured they were damaging type enemies, but they really puff up Wario like bees do. Then, because of that newfound knowledge, I assumed that an enemy like this sentient bottle of soda would do the same thing, but instead it damaged me. Stage design tends to pick a theme and stick with it, which isn't always a bad thing, but also results in shit like Pinball Zone, which is one of the most poorly designed stages I've ever seen in my entire life. The game's a mixed bag of great design, decent design, and absolute dog shit design. The great design occurs pretty frequently, but most of the time it's just decent. The really bad stuff only happens every once in a great while, but it's still in there. Different zones tend to follow a theme, like the Emerald Passage being very naturey, and the Topaz stages all resembling a playground or toy box element. Oh, a Dark City map. Nice, a haunted hotel. Oh, an Arabian nighttime map. Fire Cavern. Anyways, after the first 4 bosses, you move on to the inner pyramid to fight the floor boss, which is a pretty intense fight. Treasures disappear sooner than the 1-minute mark, making it difficult to grab all of them without any help from the item shop. Once you finally beat the boss, you move on to the next... Wait, what? Oh, that was it? Huh. Yeah, this game's short. It's really short, actually. It took me about the quarter of the time that it took me to get through Wario Land 3. Interestingly enough, there are a few different endings to the game, although they're all about the same content-wise. That cat that Wario didn't give a shit about at the beginning of the game is actually a princess, go figure. The artifacts that he collects transforms her back, and her form takes on something different depending on how many treasures you collect. Since I fucked up one of the earlier bosses and the last one, she transforms into the epitome of beauty, and what all women envy. But if you want to do it the right way, the game actually encourages you to beat all the bosses again in a pseudo-boss rush. This time she turns into her true form, which is this short-haired anime princess. The other forms are weird in their own ways, as missing a couple of them makes her a teenager, and missing most or all of them turns her into a fucking toddler. Yep, thanks Japan. Last in the lineup of Wario Land games, and the final one that came out, was the 2008 Wii game Wario Land Shake It. I was super excited to try this one out because the game is absolutely gorgeous. It's a fully hand-drawn game and it just oozes charm. Unfortunately for me and this video, I can't actually weigh in on it. The motion controls of the game killed any chance that I had to record it, which really does suck. I had considered just watching footage and making an assessment, but I honestly can't bring myself to do that just because it wouldn't give me the same impression. But looking into its background, the general consensus seems to be that it's pretty to look at with a short playtime and relatively easy to beat levels. General reviews gave it around a 7 to a 7.5 out of 10, stating that the game suffered from motion control related issues at times, and it seemed to be aimed more towards a casual friendly audience. Take that for what you will, but also note that it is the last Wario Land game to come out in over a decade. Of course, there are a few other non-Wario Land or WarioWare games which have hit the market, including Wario World for the GameCube and Wario Master of Disguise for the DS. The former seemed to be an experiment to see how Wario would adjust to a 3D experience and was chastised for being a very short game. And the latter unfortunately suffered from the touchscreen control fad which plagued a lot of Nintendo DS games during its run. For some context, I played Wario World as a kid and definitely beat it in about a day or two, and I completely lost interest when I played Master of Disguise in high school. It's sad, but as WarioWare games took off, it seems that Wario's core adventures fell victim to, hey, people love these mini-games, let's make platformers that have fun motion control and touchscreen-based mechanics implemented into them. It's hard to say if this is the cause of Wario's recent absence from platformers, or if there's something more to it than that. But I can tell you that even today, these old Game Boy games hold up. They're fun and rewarding and different. I don't really have any more to say about them than I already have, other than I'm glad that my vague and fuzzy memory of these games turned out to be more than just nostalgia for me. I don't know if they'll ever make a return to form, but I can tell you that if there's ever another Wario Land game, I'll have my eye on it in the hopes that our fat, greedy anti-hero makes his triumphant comeback in something other than a collection of microgames. Thanks for watching. I didn't mean to turn this into this long of an escapade, but when do I ever? As always, you can catch me occasionally on Twitch, streaming random things that I'm bad at. I say stuff on Twitter every here and there, and there's a Discord if you want to chill out there until the next video. I don't really have anything else to say, so I wish you good tidings. Yeah. Have a good one.